All right, and welcome to everyone to Happy Hour. This is me, Eileen Cook. This is the chance that we have to talk about all things crafty. So today I'm excited because we have some pages from the member Elizabeth Dawson, who's put in a little bit of a short story. So we're going to be taking a look at that today. But I also wanted to put out a call. Does anyone have any specific questions or news or anything that they wanted to share before we jump in? A couple shaking heads of the nose, all that kind of stuff. All right, so then we will jump in. We're going to go through Elizabeth's pages, and then we're also going to use that as kind of a launching pad to talk about a couple of other things. So what I am going to do, hopefully successfully, is share this page. So hopefully you guys can actually now see that. So we'll see how that goes. It's always technology is a little bit of a misnomer. So I actually really enjoyed this. This was a short story, somewhere between short story and flash fiction, depending on how you want to define that. For people who have questions, flash fiction is often quite a bit shorter, but is that idea of a really compressed short story. And this one is fairly concise. During World War II, although that's never expressly said, that's certainly my guess on the time period. So I will send these pages directly back to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, if you're desperately trying to make notes, don't worry about that. I will be happy to send those notes directly on to you. So what I wanted to look at here is some of the big picture things that I think might be helpful for everyone. So one of the things that I do want to start talking about or bring up is to talk about the idea of starting in action. And that is something that I am really happy to see that Elizabeth did, which particularly is important in a short story. So in a novel, you sometimes get a little bit more space to kind of woo your way into a story. But with short stories, you really don't have that time or space. So you really need to get going. And in fact, one of the pieces of advice that I've gotten several times is the idea that you probably want to start a scene later than you think, and you probably want to get out of a scene earlier than you think, which is the idea that oftentimes, we take too long to get to the story, and then once we've gotten to the story, we take a little bit too long hanging out in it. So our goal is oftentimes to try and do that. In terms of how to go about doing that, one, you may be the kind of person who just writes that way. And if you are, good on ya. I am happy for you. I am not. I am one of those people who, unfortunately or fortunately for me, I do have to write my way into a story. So what it means for me is that often as I'm writing, I write a bunch of stuff that eventually gets cut. So I often discover that my story or my novel actually starts in chapter 3, but I had to write chapters 1 and 2 to sort of figure that out for myself. So don't worry if you're not starting with a bang, but in this case, one of the things that Elizabeth does is she does start. So we have these two characters, Ruby and Nance. We can tell that they're friends, and that basically, unfortunately, we're getting some really bad news, which is that Albert, who is one of their beaux, plane has gone down, and it's not believed that he's going to survive. So we're starting right with the action, which is great. So two things that I wanted to point out here. So one, there's this line, Ruby's legs buckled and Nance caught her dear friend around the waist as they slowly hit the floor together. It was a dance that usually happened due to laughter, because boy, did these two enjoy a good laugh. I love the idea that we're normally seeing that these are great friends and that they're having that, but the line actually threw me a little bit because they had just gotten news that Albert, poor Albert, did not make it. So having the sudden switch in tone, which is how I would describe that, actually breaks the story a little bit for me, because I'm having this moment where we've opened with this shocking piece of news that Albert has gone down, and then to switch and say, oh, but normally they're doing this because they're laughing, and boy, do these two love a good laugh, for me just took me out of that moment. And I think that's, again, something when we're looking for all of us, is that idea of we're laying a lot of groundwork. Our goal as writers is to kind of put people in an emotion that's a little bit jarring. So one example that I'm going to give that I think can be useful is, I don't know how many people have seen the IKEA commercial with the little lamp. So they show the lamp, it's been left outside by the trash, it's raining, you see the little lamp has the little like slight hedge over, it's raining. They do this long shot where you see the lamp looking very sad, as if a lamp could look sad. Then you see a little girl come along. The little girl spots the lamp. She puts it in a red wagon, of all things, takes it home. You see her screw in a new light bulb. And then you see her in this little montage scene with the lamp. So there is a scene of her, reading in bed with the lamp on. There's a scene of her having a tea party, and the lamp is one of the things on the seat. And you actually find yourself in this very short 30-second ad feeling a little happy for the lamp that it's found a new forever home. And then they actually jar you out of it, because then they break out and it's the weird Swedish guy from IKEA who does, "You feel sorry for the little lamp, don't you?" And it jars you out of the moment, because you suddenly realize, like, oh, wait a minute, this is not this serious, sad moment. So that's an example of jarring someone out tonally that works really well, because you almost find yourself laughing, like, oh my gosh, I was caring about a lamp. Suddenly I feel very guilty about all the things I take to Goodwill, right? So all of a sudden there's this emotional connection. But when you do have someone in a scene, you also want to sometimes keep them in the scene. And for me, Elizabeth, this pulled me out of the scene when suddenly Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up here in the first start of the story, which I think is really useful for all of us, is the idea of point of view. Show of hands, how many people have heard the term head hopping used before? So a couple people. So head hopping is the idea that you are about this. So you will read articles of people who say all right, I think I'm back. I got booted out, which has never happened before. Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yay, okay. That is a good thing. So I'm not entirely sure where I cut out, but
For me, you cut out.
Somewhere
right
around talking about head hopping.
Exactly.
Perfect.
And
That was the idea of head hopping. So head hopping is the idea that you are changing point of view within the scene. And you're going to see people who will say that you absolutely can never do this. There are people that it drives crazy. I know a lot of people who do freelance edits will go insane with their red pen when they see head hopping. And then you can look at someone like Nora Roberts, who is a New York Times bestseller, who head hops like crazy in her books. So what is head hopping? So it is the idea that you're in one person's point of view and then changing to another person's point of view within that same scene. Why is it that some people don't like it? Well, the biggest reason is it can feel potentially jarring to the reader. So keeping in mind that readers, what we're usually trying to do is be part of that scene. So for a lot of readers, what we're actually wanting is that idea that we are a part of a scene. So we're wanting to be in that moment with everyone else. We're wanting to feel that same thing that the character is feeling. And when you change from one person's point of view to another, it just takes me a moment as the reader to reshift within that. So for Elizabeth in her scene, we start in Nance's point of view. She's hesitating, she's fiddling with the buttons. Then we're kind of starting to shift back and forth between Ruby's point of view and my would be that in general, sticking with one point of view, particularly in a short story, is going to serve you a little bit better. That doesn't mean you can't change points of view, so you might do it within like a scene change. So you can see as Elizabeth goes on, we have a scene where Ruby and Nance are having this experience of getting this news about Albert, and then there is a scene change. And then we are at their house. So that would be a place where if you wanted to change point of view, that's where I would change it. Now, that is not a hard and fast rule. And again, there will be people who tell you, and have examples of people who do head hopping and where it works delightfully. I'm just going to argue that in general, for most of us, we do a little bit better if we're not head hopping. So they've gotten this bad news, and then we flash forward. We can tell that some time has passed. So Ruby and Nance are spending time together. That we're using dialogue and sort of how dialogue is laid out as a way of showing an accent. So for example, we have her say, "Oi now, who's this?" Now, please excuse my very bad Cockney accent there. "Oi now, who's this?" Nance was looking through the window. "It's a man. Go open the door, Ruby. I'll check me lipstick." So that's a nice example of putting in what I would sometimes call a little bit of flavor text, which just gives us a sense of the scene. I just always put a warning to people is a little can go a long way, because what happens for the reader is as I'm reading, I need to sort of slow down and sound out those things to make sure that I'm reading it correctly. So a little goes a long way. And this is about trusting your reader. And this is about having some faith that for the reader, what's going to hopefully happen is if you put in a line like this, or "Oi now, who's this?" After that, forevermore, I will read Nancy with a little bit of that Cockney accent in my head. The reader will have a lot of faith and they will sort of stick along with it. Some positive things that I also pointed out for Elizabeth here is thinking about places to put in those sensory details. So she has a moment where this gentleman's walking up the walk with his cane, tip, clack, tip, tap, click, tap, click, tap, click. And I liked the actual addition of the sounds because that added something for me. Again, for me, this is something that I often don't worry about until the revision stage. So I'm always warning people, don't get caught in feeling like I'm not doing all the things I have to do all the time. I never do them until much later. And in fact, I believe Elizabeth had said this was even an early draft. So kudos to her to putting that in. Most of us are usually pretty good at putting in those visual senses. So we describe how things look. But when you're revising, going back and thinking, is there a place to put in a scent? Is there a place to put in something like this, like an actual sound or a texture, can often go a long way to sort of adding to that. So what people will discover is very good news. Albert has not, in fact, died. So we can all give a small cheer for Albert. He has survived his plane crash and he has returned. Then we have a sort of scene where we're finding out what happened to him. So he's talking about he basically was hidden and was able to survive and come back. Then we have a new scene where they're starting to think about moving to Canada. And I just, probably it's a little bit of bias of mine, but I do think little touches of humor can go a long way, particularly if you're writing a story that might at times be a little bit dark. So there's a line here, and I probably like it because I'm living in Canada, is they're talking about going to Canada, and the person says, "Quebec, who's ever heard of Quebec?" Aren't there bloody igloos everywhere? So it's just a tiny little nod towards humor. And again, keeping that in mind as you're, editing and revising, is there a place where you can add in a tiny bit of that? So they've decided that they're going to go to Canada. Off they head. They end up meeting someone, and she describes him as a blonde bear waving a straw fedora. And that for me was just a really nice description. I had a very clear image of what this fellow looked like. It turns out he's actually quite into motorcycles. And so what they're going to do is sort of learn to race motorcycles. Now, this is where I brought up another issue for Elizabeth that I think is interesting for other people, which is why we're talking about it in happy hours, is to think about which character is driving the story. And again, this kind of cycles back to earlier when I was talking about point of view, is that for me, because we're kind of going between different points of view, I wasn't certain who I was, for lack of a better term, cheering for. Whose goal is it that we are pursuing, and what's going for that? So in a short story, particularly a literary short story, you don't have to have as much of a driving action. So if you're writing commercial fiction, there needs to be a clear goal that the character is searching for. I want to open my own bakery. They have to have a clear reason for that. I want to open my own bakery because my mother owned a bakery and she died when I was young, and I want to refill that dream of hers. And then something gets in the way of that goal. However, there's a nefarious baker in town who keeps trying to shut me down, so I'm not the competition. So this is a story about that. The way I once heard it described was by a screenwriting instructor who used the term, the character's goal is the destination or the train ticket that you have sold to your reader. The character either achieves that thing or does not achieve that thing. So for me, that was always a nice way, because people have sort of bought a train ticket. You've given them a destination. This is a book about whether or not Eileen will find true love. And at the end of the book, I either have my happily ever after, and I'm walking up the aisle to the man I love, or I'm not. If you're writing a murder mystery, often the train ticket is, this is a ticket to find out who killed Samantha. And the train ticket is over when we find out who is responsible for doing that. It doesn't mean that the character always gets what they want. Like oftentimes you may shift or change that, but that's the destination. And one of the things I noticed as I was reading Elizabeth's story around this point in the story is I wasn't sure what I was cheering for, what it was that I wanted these characters to achieve. I enjoyed the journey, like I enjoyed what was going on, and I happen to love historical, so for me this is always kind of fun. And the dialogue between the characters was working, but I wasn't sure what I was cheering for them to do. Again, this is a little bit less sometimes with literary fiction, where it doesn't have to be quite as clear, but what is it that I'm we know that they're going to be doing this motorcycling. Uh-oh, we're having technical problems. Am I back?
Yep.
Okay. Apparently I keep freezing, so not sure what's happening there. You gotta love that. All right, so these guys are gonna go on like some basically motorcycle races. And the next part that I want to bring up that I think is good for everyone is thinking about the word tension. And tension is an interesting thing within a short.
Lost you again.
So the best kind of tension that I can give as an example is if you have ever watched a horror movie and a character hears a noise and walks outside, and then like a creepy music starts to play, and you start to get that really bad feeling that something's about to happen, and it starts to build as an emotional feeling, that's tension. Completely opposite example, it would be something in a romance where you see two characters kind of coming together, not coming together, and you have a moment about, are they going to kiss? Is this going to happen? Is this going to be that moment? that's anticipation and that's tension within this. So I think there's a missed opportunity for Elizabeth here, because what we see is Albert is racing around the bend. He's actually spilled off his bike, so he's laying on the ground. And they have this line like, we better go help him off the track. So he's bruised, but he should be fine. And of course, what you don't know, because I haven't scrolled up to that, is in a minute, someone else is going to come around that track, and it's not going to go particularly well for our man, Albert. But there's a way to build this. And I think where this would be someone like Ruby, who sees him on the ground, so she's worried that something's going to happen. Keep in mind, she almost lost him once before because he crashed his plane, right? So this is a moment where the reader can start to be like, uh-oh, he's fallen on the tracks and I'm not sure he's going to be okay. The guy's saying he's going to be okay, but I don't know if he's really going to be okay. But by not giving us that tension, he says, oh, he's going to be fine, he's bruised. And we go, oh, okay, he'll be fine, he's bruised. In the same way, if a character's walking outside, we don't think something's going to happen. It's the music behind us that tells us something's going to happen. And you can play with tension in two ways, either by fulfilling the tension. So in the case of something bad happening, that someone does jump out at the girl at that moment, or the characters do kiss, or you can show it as a missed opportunity. So someone is trying to make that happen, but it in fact does not happen. But this would be a place where, for Elizabeth, I think adding in the tension where we see that Ruby is really worried, he's down on the ground, he doesn't look great, that kind of thing. Then we'll make the fact when this other biker comes around the corner, hits this oil patch, and basically slams right into Albert, and the bike slams into him with full force. Then you have that extra of like, oh, because we had almost seen it coming. It's the idea of, and I think everyone has had this experience where you're maybe watching, for me it's babysitting, but for some of you it may be having been moms, where you see a kid doing something and there's that moment before they fall, there's that moment before the bad thing happens where you think they're going to fall off that slide. And then like in almost slow motion, then your worst fear is realized and they do fall. So this is a great place to think about, are there places in your own manuscript where you can be adding tension? And sometimes you do want the surprise, like you don't want the reader to have any sense that it's about to happen. But there are times where tension will pull the reader along because it becomes that question of what will happen, what's going to happen next, all those kinds of things. For people who know Don Moss, he's a literary agent out in New York. He's a frequent speaker if you go to the Surrey Writers Conference. He has several great books about writing, but he talks a lot about everything you're doing should be raising a question for the reader. And that's the idea that they're wanting to kind of read what's going to happen next. So a very clunky over-the-top example, so sorry about this, is the idea that you end a chapter with something like, there was a knock at the door, I flung the door open, I couldn't believe who was standing there, and then you end the chapter. It's a very clunky example, but what of course it does is for the reader, they go, who was standing there, right? And they're going to automatically sort of turn the page, and they're going to want to read more. I had a book, or I should say I didn't have it, I still have it. It's called Do or Die. And the opening line, this vending machine falls on her best friend, so a Diet Coke machine. So the opening line is, more people are killed in vending machine accidents than in shark attacks. But I couldn't imagine a better person for it to happen to than my best friend. So when I was talking to Don Moss about this, because I know him from someplace else, he talked about how even though that's not an obvious question for the reader, the question becomes, if someone is your best friend, why would you want a vending machine to fall on them? Why would you even have that thought? And even though they may not consciously be like, I wonder why they have that kind of friendship, on an unconscious level, they are wondering that. And so they'll start to read the next paragraph or the next line to see if that question is in fact answered. That's tension. So thinking about, are there ways in your manuscript that you can add tension to a scene? So I have bad news for you, people who are cheering for Albert. It's not going to go well for poor Albert. He's been hit by this bike. Because I've suggested that Elizabeth make some cuts in other areas, one area where I would like a little bit more is there's this line, Ruby ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Albert, she screams. She's running to the body of this airman that she loves. I believe, I can't remember at this moment, I think they're married at this point. They've moved to Canada. They were starting their whole new life, and now this accident has happened. This is a place where, and people who've had my writing classes know this, where I will often say, I just want one more beat of emotion. I just want to stay here just a little bit longer, because this is the critical turning point in this story. This is where it's a dark moment of the soul where everything is falling apart, and I just want to take a moment there. So in other stories, people have heard me say, if you're struggling with this or don't know how to do it, take something like this scene and write down in the brackets after the line. So you might be like, oh my God, Ruby gasped as another rider rounded the bend. And then I might put in brackets for myself, so I can do this in real time, feels terrified. And then for me later when I go back, I think, is there anything else I can do? So gasped is a good example because that does add to that sort of terrified feeling. But again, I might want one more beat. Like, is there anything else I can do or say that might show that Ruby feels terrified? So does her stomach free fall? Does she, close her eyes from what she's seeing? Does she feel her heart race? Just one more beat that will tell me how bad this really is. And that could happen there. It could happen down here where I'd sort of mentioned it, but something like that. People have also heard me use the term, but I don't think Elizabeth has, so now she's stuck hearing it, about tiny little micro cuts, which are little tiny cuts that you can make that will just tighten up your fiction slightly. So the line that Elizabeth had is, others were lifting the bike off him. She nearly fell on him in an effort to get her arms around him. So for me, there were just a lot of hims happening in a short amount of space. So I would cut for sure that I would just change it to, she nearly fell in an effort to get her arms around him. So that might be a place. Otherwise, you could try and do something else. Others were lifting the bike off and get rid of the him there. But someplace where, again, you can just tighten that up slightly. And sometimes people will say to me, but it's not grammatically wrong what I have. Another one that I will often cut is someone will say, I stood up. And I'll be like, I stood. Sometimes works just as well because you usually don't stood down. It's not something you do, so you can kind of cut the up. And it's not that it's wrong. It's not that it's unclear. It's just a way to slightly tighten things. And I can't stress enough, and you'll sometimes hear from people, you're really looking to try and make your prose as tight as possible. You don't want to let off the gas so that the reader has any opportunity to sort of slow down. And so then we come to the end, because at the end, of course, we find out that Albert is in fact not okay. So one of the things that is done nice here, it's sad, it's a tragedy. You don't have to write happy stories. We have a tragedy that happens here, but it is an interesting balance between the story dying and the story ends with Albert dying. So there's something a little bit nice about that kind of bookending of a story. And people have heard me in the past say and recommend to people, stop sharing there, so that, is if you are struggling with either the beginning or the ending, is to go back once you are completely done and sort of see if whether or not there's a way to bookend things, which is what Elizabeth's done here, is she has a callback to the beginning. And that's very common. You'll see it often. So Frodo starts in the Shire, he ends in the Shire. Buddy the Elf starts in the North Pole, he ends in the North Pole. Or you'll see opposites sometime is another way of bookending things. So we see a character in the Hunger Games, we see Katniss in this tiny town, and she's a very different person. So we're trying to show that she's different. So that is another way of thinking about how can you bookend that. If you are an amazing outliner, kudos to you. You might be able to set that up before you even start writing. But for most of us mere mortals, what ends up happening is I have to write the scene, and then when I have the whole thing, I can then go back and find that. So we can do that. We are going to have a master little video class from Mary Robinette Kowal. Some people know her. She is a science fiction writer. She's won the Hugo for her short stories, and we did an interview with her about writing short stories. So I will make sure as soon as that's posted, if it hasn't been, that you guys see the link for that. Short stories are a great way to sort of try out all of this process without writing an entire novel. What I will say is, if short stories are not your jam, that is okay. For myself, I went through this period of time where I felt like I had to write and publish short stories or no one would take me seriously as a novelist. And so I forced myself to write all these short stories and send them off. And to be honest, they were not very good. Short story is a skill set that I do not have in great things. I have a much bigger tendency to do better with a longer form where I can stretch things out. So if you love writing short stories, or if you are interested in writing short stories, I think it is a great craft exercise. I think it's a great craft exercise even if you don't ever intend to send them anywhere. It's the practice of writing a beginning, a middle, and end, having a chance to see how does it open, how do I get the tension in a much more condensed space. I will never remember the writer's name, but it was someone who spoke at Surrey, talked about they did a short story a week for a year. Wendy's mouth just fell open, which I thought was fabulous. So, I mean, just one, the discipline of that, but it's certainly very doable. It's not an unreasonable thing to do, right? And so for them, it was the practice of every single week. And this individual talked about like halfway through the year, they started sending out those short stories because they were getting, in their opinion, a little bit better. And they were starting to send them out and have that experience of seeing those stories, in some cases, get published. And in some cases, not get published, but having the experience of doing it. So that is a challenge that you can give. And yeah, I think, Marianne, you put it like writing is a craft. And I don't know any other way to describe it. And I don't know why we're so hard on ourselves as writers, but I don't know if anyone else has tried to take up any other artistic endeavor. So if you were painting and you sat down and you were like, I'm going to paint, and the first thing that you drew didn't look like the picture, like it was more of a stick figure, right? You wouldn't be like, oh, well, obviously I have no artistic talent, or I would have been able to make it look like the Mona Lisa. But for some reason with writing, we do that. Like we write a draft and we think, well, that's not perfect, so clearly I'm the problem here. Nobody sits down at a piano and goes like, I've never played the piano before. I think I'll start with this Mozart concerto and see how it goes. We don't expect that of ourselves in these other art forms. We don't expect to sit down and make a piece of furniture and have it look like a fancy dresser from, the French Revolution. But yet with writing, we do that. But it is a craft, and it is something that gets better the more you do it. And the more that you practice certain things. But I am going to warn about what I sometimes would call analysis paralysis. So when I first started writing was just a joy to me. I just loved it. And I started, writing stories all the time. And then I started to learn more about the craft of writing. And for a while, I got really stuck because I would be like, wait, am I head hopping there? Do I have enough emotion on the page? Is the motivation there? Is this point of view deep enough? Is my dialogue too on the nose? And I would go through this random checklist, and I would second guess every other word out of my fingers onto the keyboard. And so I would stop writing, and I would be like, clearly it's just bad. And I would go back to the beginning and try and start something else. So sometimes what you know becomes a little bit, or it can become a little bit of a barrier because you catch yourself second guessing all of those things. And this is why I have become a huge lover of revision. So I give myself permission to write whatever I want to write and tell myself I can always fix it in revision. I can always fill it out in revision. And I am constantly surprised, horrified. I have been writing since I was little. I have been a published writer since my first book sold in 2006. I am horrified, like the number of times that I still go through a draft and catch huge mistakes. Like I sort of thought I would have had it better together by now, but apparently not. The amount of times I still make those same mistakes, and sometimes through multiple revisions. I was at writing sprints this morning going over something that I've been through 2 or 3 times already. And I was going through it today and realizing I had repeated words. I had a lot of places to do those kind of tiny micro cuts. I had a head hop in the middle of a scene all of a sudden. And again, this is something I have been through at least 3 times already. So this is my moment to say, you have to be nice to yourself and give yourself permission to, as Elizabeth Berg calls it, write those shitty first drafts and just let it be out there. So I know Elizabeth doesn't have a mic on her computer while she's so quiet, but I wanted to give her a chance in the chat window. Elizabeth, did you have any questions for me or anyone in the group, or wanting feedback from anyone? And I will also open it up. Did anyone else have any thoughts? Obviously, I'm just scrolling through Elizabeth's piece, so you don't have the chance to read it and give thoughts. But it is a good reminder for people. We do have that section in GLIP where you can swap things. So if you are looking for other people to read pages, that's a very appropriate place to go and post and say, hey, I just finished a short story. If anyone can take a look through it, I'm looking for a reader, happy to read and swap your pages. And you can do that, which will be my free reminder and plug to remind people that feedback, especially in here, is always meant to be positive and encouraging, which doesn't mean you don't point out areas that you think someone should work on or change, but it's just a reminder that none of us are in charge. It is someone else's story. And it's also perfectly appropriate to ask for very specific types of feedback. So if you are a writer in an earlier stage and your writing still feels very vulnerable and you still very anxious about putting it out there, which is totally normal and completely part of the process, it is okay to say, I'm asking for someone to look through this first draft and I'm just wanting to know what works really well. That's what I'm looking for because I'm going to build on that. Or just big picture things, please. It's also perfectly okay to be like, I'm a crusty old writer who has been around for a long time. And what I'm really looking for is any nitpicky things, any tiny thing that threw you out of the story, any of those things, because what you're looking for, you want that kind of thing, which still doesn't mean anyone should ever be not nice, but it's just an idea that it's a chance to sort of note back on that. All right, so I see in the chat window that Elizabeth has no questions, which is great. And Elizabeth, I will email you back your short story with my notes in it, so you'll have a little bit more. And if something there doesn't make sense, then let me know. And Wendy, you have a question. So what is it?
Yeah, I'm just curious. And I don't write short stories either. They make me crazy. But when we had to teach short story writing in high school, so that's kind of where I come from here. There was always this, the thought about time compression and that a short story had to happen within a very short time frame. So you couldn't have a scene like here where they're there and he almost dies and then they get married and then they decide to move and then they go somewhere else. And that didn't happen. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And probably the high school thing is completely dead off and wrong. And everything goes because high school is, what you teach in high school is very often not the real world. So I just wondered what the current thought was on that. Can you do that? Can you put it over time?
So, all right. The short answer is yes, you can. I think what you will see is that in a lot of short stories, time is very compressed. And that is because, again, and like this is a good example, we have 5 pages in this short story. That's not a lot of space and time, like on the actual page. And the more that you are changing time frames, the risk that you run is that no one is ever kind of feeling deeply in that moment. So you will see some short stories that are incredibly compressed, that take place within 2 or 3 minutes. I'm trying to remember, there's the one that we all had to read about the character on the bridge and the devil's going to make him jump, and I can't remember. But it takes place in the second between when the fellow actually, he's about to be hung. So it's the moment from when he steps off, I don't know what you call it, the thing where you're going to hang from, to where he's actually dead. So the short story takes place in those 2 or 3 seconds between when his neck snaps, right? So you'll sometimes see it very compressed. You will occasionally see this done in a novel, although not very often. I don't know if anyone read the book The Dinner. It's by a German author whose name totally escapes me at the moment, something like Woke. The Dinner is a full-length fat novel that takes place over the course of the dinner. So the novel is actually broken up into appetizer, main meal, and it's a conversation happening between these 2 couples. But yeah, typically in short stories, you'll tend to see them a bit more compressed. They don't have to be. One of the things I would suggest for people, just in terms of the form, although here's the thing, this is not a rule and there is no formal homework in this group, yay. But it can be well worth it to pick up, and no doubt your library has them. They come out every year. It's a collection of best short stories. So it's America's Best Short Stories. Each year it's done by a guest editor. And they have picked as widely as Margaret Atwood and Stephen King. So quite broad range about different kinds of people who are editing those. And it'll be something like 30 to 50 short stories in this one little book. There are also certainly anthologies if there are particular things that you like. So if you like romance, there are romance anthologies, there are science fiction anthologies, horror anthologies. But just reading through a huge group of short stories can be really interesting around, I did not like that at all. Like, why didn't I like that short? Like, what was it about this that didn't work for me? And then to go on to the next one and be like, I just flew through that short story. Like, what was it that worked? And that's that idea of reading as a writer, which I think is somewhat harder to do sometimes with novel-length fiction, because it's so hard not to become immersed in that story and be caught up in it completely, which is why I often will suggest to people it's worthwhile at times to go back and reread a novel. So read it once just because you love it, and then go back and break down, like, why did I love it? What was it about that? Like, where was the part where I was fascinated? So how could I potentially, do something with that? So that can be a really nice way of doing it. But reading short stories is just a faster version of that because they're much more condensed. So 2 things, and Kristen pointed out in the window, so I want to do that. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth, who recognized the short story I was trying to think of, perhaps, The Necklace. There are a lot of flash fiction sites that are sending out a story a day. There are so many online resources now for short stories. Like, just getting in the habit again, because I think they're so digestible. Like, they're tiny in many cases, and flash fiction's even tinier. So having that where you do that is just a great way of sort of checking it out and figuring out, I think, and asking yourself the question, what is working and what's not, and why? And I think that's why reading other people's pages or critiquing other writers' pages can be such a useful process, because it's so much easier to fix somebody else's story. Someday I will understand why that is true, but it is so much easier because I can read someone else's story and be like, oh, of course what you should do is this, this, and this. And then I read my own stuff and don't see it at all. So that's a way of sort of understanding that that might be something that's helpful for you. So reading, again, a short story and being like, what worked? Why did I like it? Is there something from that that I can use in my own fiction? Alyssa, you had a question about revisions.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any advice for, I guess, how to go about it. I'm kind of feeling a bit like I'm not making any progress and I'm floundering and I keep rewriting the same scene instead of what I know I should be moving on and that sort of thing.
So here's shocking to anyone who knows me. I do have an opinion on this. So first off, in the tools section of the Academy, we do have a resource that is a revisions checklist. So the revisions checklist might be helpful for people. So it has some ideas of things that you can look at. So the revisions checklist would be definitely something I would check out. The other thing I would say is I am not a huge fan of revising as I'm still writing. Because I think I do exactly what you're talking about, Alyssa, which is I write and then I will go back and I could revise that same scene 1,000 times instead of pushing on. So for me, I always do give myself permission to go back and read what I've read before. I might make a few notes. I might change a few things. But I'm also a huge fan of putting things in the manuscript to go back to. So for example, my next book, which is called You Owe Me a Murder. It's a happy title. So in this particular book, I had a character, and then when I was writing the book, he was the gay best friend of the main character. And about 3/4 of the way through the book, I realized like what would add additional tension and conflict is if they had romantic feelings for each other. So I actually did XXX, all capital X's, and I wrote in the manuscript, from this point on, he's not gay, XXX. And then I just kept writing. And I knew I would have to go back. And the reason I do triple X's is because it's very easy to find and search for if you're doing on Word. I just do a search for triple X, and that's any place. So sometimes I do it like XXX, find a poison that can't be traced. And then I just keep going as if I know the answer to it. So I don't go down some research click hole, which I'm infamous for. But if I have some thought like revisions need to have better motivation here, and then I just keep going. Because it's really easy to get stuck in, and you'll hear the term rearranging the deck chairs versus, am I actually making this any better or am I just moving things around? And when I feel like I'm just moving things around, I'm like, I have to just let it go and go forward from there. Does that help, Alyssa, or did that just make it worse?
So I have finished the first draft.
Okay, good.
I guess in the first draft, I felt like I could just do that, throw X's in and say, fix this later. But then I feel like I've kind of got to the point where then I've got all these things that need to get fixed now. I don't know how to fix them.
So you'll see in the revisions checklist, I start with big and then start moving in smaller. So and again, that's because I'm sometimes doing multiple revision rounds. Like that's the whole thing where I thought, I'll just go through this once. No, I'm going to go through this a few different times. So the first thing I start with is questions like, have I fulfilled the promise to the reader? So if I set this up, that's a train ticket I was talking about with the short story. So if I set this up, that this is a book about whether or not this character solves this murder, have I done that or did I get off track? And so I kind of start with big story questions and then slowly move in. And it's only kind of to the last round that I'm really worried about, was that supposed to be a semicolon or a comma? Because otherwise I can get caught up on crafting those things. So kind of going back, but it's okay. Like if you get to a certain point, like I've revised this scene a few times, I still don't feel like it's quite right, but I'm going to go on because sometimes it's revising the scenes that come later that give me the clue. I do write oftentimes in my fancy notebooks, and I am a huge fan of the writing of notes. If I was Crystal, this would all be done in some fancy spreadsheet, likely on Excel, that would be searchable and color-coded. Not for me. So I always have to go back and look through it. But what I'm looking for is I might put a note like in chapter 4, motivation still not clear. And then I will go back, and as I'm revising later scenes, I try to see if there is something that might answer that question for me. or a way that I can get a bang for the buck. Like, oh, it could be that motivation for chapter 4, and it can add a conflict in chapter 8. So that's a better way to go. Marianne said, when I review with an eye for revision, I invariably add words. Given your advice regarding micro edits, this feels backwards. Oh, Marianne, you just are backwards. No, I add a lot of words too. And that's because people have probably heard me say, I think there are two kinds of writers in this world. There are people who write long, who have a lot of cutting to do when they have a draft. And there are people who write short. And short, those of us who write short means that we tend to leave a lot of stuff out. And when I'm going back through revisions, I realize, like, I need more depth here. I need more character detail or description or feeling or emotion. And so I need to add that in. So I think it's totally fine to be adding words, but, comma, making sure that those words then have the biggest bang for the buck. And looking for, where are those places where I could take tiny words out that potentially might just move the story along. And that's the idea, that you can add a lot of words, but it doesn't mean they're always good words. That's the challenge. But I wouldn't worry. I typically, my first drafts tend to be about 10 to 15,000 words shorter than what my final draft will end up being. So I'm adding a fairly significant chunk of things in later revision rounds. So yeah, my books are usually somewhere between 75 and 85,000 words. So to be adding, 15,000 of those lets you know that it's usually probably pretty short when I first start. So sometimes that's adding a subplot. Sometimes that's just fleshing out the story, because I realized I didn't put enough meat on the bones.
I feel like I'm when I'm adding words, I'm clarifying or tinting things because I want more micro control. But then I worry that I'm, over explaining things.
Well, I've seen some of your pages, and I can't say I've ever thought, my God, that Marianne Shear writes fluffy. If she just cut some of this down, we'd be moving along way better.
They're just different words.
Yeah, I mean, I do think,
the first.
And I've talked about, with people, like, thinking about sometimes what words. So sometimes it's not even adding words, but it's changing a word. So he walked into the room becomes he strode into the room, or becomes he ambled into the room, or he slunk into the room. Like, there are times where I'm not adding words, I'm just choosing a better word. I'm giving a verb that's maybe got a little more bang for the buck than the one I had initially used. Sometimes it is about what you're talking about, that clarification. So that opportunity to sort of hone in a little bit, to maybe layer in some added tension. So, I mean, you'll see in Elizabeth's piece today, like, there are a few points where I'm like, I want a little bit more emotion here. Like, give me another beat of emotion. Or, what is her thoughts or feelings at this particular moment? And I'm wanting that little extra oomph because I think it will add to the story. Which doesn't mean there isn't another place in another paragraph where you can't take some things out. So that, I guess, is my very long-winded answer to your question, Marianne, which is, it's great to add things, but that doesn't mean you don't still take some things out. You're trying to do kind of both in that revision process.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Any last questions? All right, so we have actually another office hours this evening if people are interested. And again, we have some pages this evening. And if anyone else has pages or would like something to be looked at, that is always an option. As always, if you have any questions, you can fire them off to me in GLIP. I'm always available. Unfortunately, usually stalking my computer, so that's not a problem. And I want to thank everybody for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.